The sky over the New Mexico territory had been the color of a bleached bone for 3 weeks. Heat shimmered above the grama grass, making the distant mesas tremble as if they were just a dream. For Alina Carter, this unforgiving landscape was both a prison and a sanctuary. Her world had shrunk to the size of a one-room sod cabin, a stubborn little molehill of earth and timber hunkered against a vast, indifferent emptiness. At 19, she should have been thinking about church socials and calico dresses. Instead, her thoughts were of snaring rabbits, hoarding water, and the suffocating weight of whispers she had traveled 500 miles to escape. The whispers had followed her from a small, righteous town in East Texas, chasing her out after the scandal with Jedediah Croft. He was a man twice her father's age, with a wife like a pillar of salt and hands that were always cold. Even in the summer heat, it wasn't love. It was a desperate bid for a different life, a foolish girl's mistake that had ended with her being branded a harlot and him being hailed as a man who had resisted temptation. So she had left. She had taken what little money she had and walked west, towards the horizon, believing freedom lay somewhere in the silence of the plains. She had found the silence, but freedom felt a lot like loneliness. This afternoon, the silence was breaking. A bruised purple line appeared on the western horizon, swelling like a plague boil. The air, once thick and still, began to stir with a nervous energy. The birds fell quiet. Alina stood in the doorway of her soddy, a hand shielding her eyes. A storm was coming. Not a gentle summer shower, but a true prairie beast, the kind that could tear the roof from a cabin and send rivers of mud coursing through the arroyos. Her water barrel was nearly empty. A trip to the creek was a risk, but going without water through a storm that could last for days was a certainty of suffering. Tying her sun-bleached bonnet tight under her chin, she grabbed the 2 wooden buckets. The wind was already plucking at her faded cotton dress, whipping strands of honey-blonde hair from her braid across her face. The walk to the creek was short, but with the sky darkening by the second, it felt like a journey across a dying world. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, struck her face as she reached the shallow, rock-strewn creek bed. They hit the dry earth around her with a sound like sizzling fat. She plunged one bucket into the thin stream of water, the sound of it filling a dull gurgle against the rising moan of the wind. As she pulled it out, heavy and sloshing, a flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in a stark, ghostly white. In that brief, silent explosion of light, she saw him. He was sprawled near the opposite bank, half hidden by a cluster of salt cedars. At first, she thought he was a log, or a shadow. But a shadow didn't wear buckskin leggings. A shadow didn't have a shock of jet-black hair fanned out in the mud. He was a Navajo, an Indian. Everything she had ever been taught about them screamed through her mind in a cacophony of fear. Savage, killer, scalper. The stories told around the fire back home were of men like him, specters of the wilderness who preyed on solitary homesteads. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening roar that vibrated through the soles of her worn-out boots. The rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. She dropped the bucket, water splashing over her feet, and crouched low behind a boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should run, flee back to the cabin, bar the door, and pray he hadn't seen her. He was likely dead anyway, a casualty of some tribal war or a run-in with a patrol from Fort Union. Leaving him was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But as she peered through the deluge, she saw the unnatural angle of his leg and the dark stain spreading across the thigh of his buckskins. He wasn't moving. Another fork of lightning lit the scene, and she saw his face young, sharp-featured, and pale beneath his copper skin. His chest rose and fell in a shallow, ragged rhythm. He was alive. Alina closed her eyes, her mind a battleground. The world had cast her out. The good, church-going folk of her town had looked at her with disgust. their judgment as sharp as any blade. They had offered no mercy, no understanding. They had left her to her fate. Was she now to do the same, to leave this man, whatever he was, to be washed away by the flash flood that would soon turn this meek creek into a raging torrent, a wave of anger, cold and sharp, cut through her fear. Anger at Jedediah Croft, at the town, at a world that sorted people into neat boxes of good and bad, civilized and savage. She was an outcast, and so, in all likelihood, was he. "Damn it all," she muttered into the wind, the words swallowed by the storm. Scrambling across the slick rocks, she reached his side. He was heavier than he looked, all wiry muscle and solid bone. A deep gash, crusted with dried blood and fresh mud, ran along his temple. His leg was worse. A piece of shattered wood, the remnant of an arrow or a lance, protruded from his thigh, the flesh around it swollen and angry. He was burning with fever, his skin hot to the touch even in the cold rain. There was no way she could carry him. She would have to drag him. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his, planting her feet in the sucking mud. He was dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. She pulled, her muscles screaming in protest. The 100 yards back to her cabin felt like a mile. The mud fought her, the wind shoved her, and the rain tried to beat her into the ground. Twice. She fell, her face pressing into the wet earth, the taste of grit on her tongue. Each time, she got up, fueled by a stubbornness she didn't know she possessed. She thought of the looks on the faces of the women in town, their lips pursed in pious condemnation. The memory was like a spur in her side, driving her forward. Finally, she reached the soddy, her body shaking with exhaustion. She tumbled through the door, dragging him in after her, and collapsed onto the dirt floor, gasping for breath. The heavy plank door swung shut with a boom, plunging the small space into near darkness. The roar of the storm was now muffled, a constant, angry rumble outside the thick sod walls. For a long moment, Alina lay there, the floor cold and damp beneath her, her lungs aching. The man lay beside her, a silent, broken shape in the gloom. Slowly, she pushed herself up. She was soaked to the bone, her dress clinging to her like a second skin, her braid unraveling into a wet, heavy rope down her back, shivering violently. She knew she had to get a fire started and get out of these wet clothes, or the cold would take her before the fever took him. Her hands fumbled in the dark, finding the precious block of sulfur matches in their tin box on the mantel. She struck one, the flare of it blinding her for a second. In its flickering light, she lit the tallow lamp, casting a weak golden glow over the room. The space was sparse, a rough-hewn table, one chair, a stone hearth, and in the corner, a pallet of straw and wool blankets that served as her bed. She dragged the man closer to the hearth, arranging his limbs as gently as she could. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. Ignoring it, she turned her attention to the fire. Her hands, numb with cold, struggled with the kindling, but soon a small flame caught, licking at the dry wood she kept stacked inside. As the fire grew, casting dancing shadows on the walls, it began to beat back the chill. The need for warmth was urgent. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. There was no one to see, no one to judge. With clumsy, frozen fingers, she unbuttoned the front of her sodden dress. It was a miserable, heavy garment, and she peeled it off, letting it fall in a heap on the floor. Her chemise and drawers beneath were just as wet. Without a second thought, she stripped them off as well, her body craving the dry heat of the fire. She stood for a moment in the firelight, clad in nothing but her own skin, goosebumps rising all over her. She was pale and thin, but strong from months of solitary labor. Grabbing the driest of her wool blankets from the pallet, she wrapped it around her shoulders, huddling close to the growing flames, the rough wool scratching her skin. Only when the shivering began to subside did she turn her full attention back to the stranger. She had to get him out of his wet clothes, too, and she had to see to that wound. Taking a deep breath, she knelt beside him. His buckskin shirt was plastered to his torso. She worked at the leather ties at his neck, her fingers brushing against his hot skin. The intimacy of the act was not lost on her, but it was a clinical necessity. This was about survival. Nothing more. She managed to pull the wet shirt off, revealing a chest and shoulders crisscrossed with old scars, testament to a hard life. His breathing was still shallow. She moved to his leg, her stomach churning at the sight of the wound. She would have to pull the splinter out. She fetched her knife, the one she used for skinning rabbits, and held it in the fire for a moment, the metal glowing red. As she turned back, her mind focused on the grim task ahead. His eyes snapped open. They were not dull or feverish. They were sharp, black, and utterly lucid. They took in the scene in an instant: the fire, the unfamiliar walls of the cabin, and her, a white woman, kneeling over him with a knife in her hand, wrapped only in a coarse wool blanket that did nothing to hide the pale curves of her shoulders and legs. Alina froze, the knife still in her hand. The blanket suddenly felt impossibly thin. Every nerve in her body screamed. She was trapped in a tiny room with a wounded, cornered man, a man her people considered an enemy. The air crackled with a tension thicker than the storm raging outside. His gaze was unblinking, a predator's stare filled with pain, suspicion, and a raw, untamed wildness that struck her to the core. In that moment, she wasn't his savior. She was his captor, and she was utterly, terrifyingly exposed. Time stopped. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low howl of the wind rushing past the sod walls. A mournful cry from the wilderness outside, in the flickering firelight. The man's eyes were like chips of obsidian, reflecting the flames and an intensity that seemed to burn through Alina's thin blanket. The knife in her hand, meant to be a tool of healing, suddenly felt like a weapon, a declaration of war. His hand, though shaking from fever, moved with a fluid, practiced speed toward a sheathed blade at his own hip. His fingers curled around the handle. They were locked in a stalemate, a breath away from bloodshed. Two castaways from different worlds ready to destroy each other in a dirt floor cabin while creation itself tore itself apart outside. Alina's mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic, suddenly went quiet and clear. She saw the path forward, narrow as a razor's edge. Fear would get them both killed. She had to break the spell. Slowly, deliberately, she relaxed her grip on her knife. She did not drop it, that would be a fool's move, but she turned her wrist, letting the firelight glint off the flat of the blade instead of its edge. She held it up, then moved it towards the fire, making a clear show of reheating the tip until it glowed a dull orange. Then she looked back at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she kept her expression calm. She pointed with her free hand, first at the glowing knife, then at the ugly, splintered wood protruding from his thigh. She made a soft, careful motion of prying something out. She didn't know a single word of his language, the dying tongue. But pain was universal. So, she hoped, was the gesture for help. His eyes narrowed, tracking her every movement. He was reading her. She realized, with a frightening acuity, searching for the slightest hint of deception. The hand on his own knife didn't move. He was waiting. Alina took that as permission. She edged closer on her knees, the wool blanket pooling around her waist. The proximity was unnerving. She could smell the rain on him, the scent of wet leather, pine, and the metallic tang of blood. He was the embodiment of the wild, a figure from the fearful tales her father used to tell. They're not like us. Alina, their hearts are filled with a different kind of spirit, a spirit of stone and wind. You can't ever trust it. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the rough-hewn wood of her father's porch swing beneath her. She had been a child then, wide-eyed and believing. Now, kneeling before this man. The words felt like another cage she had to escape. She hated the judgment that had been cast upon her, the way people saw only the fallen woman and not the girl inside. Was she not doing the same thing to him now? Seeing the savage and not the man bleeding on her floor, the hypocrisy of it burned in her gut, a bitter counterpoint to the fear. She focused on the wound. The flesh was torn and inflamed. A gruesome sight. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I'm sorry, but it has to come out." She laid her free hand gently on his leg, well above the injury, a gesture meant to steady and, she hoped, to reassure. His muscles bunched into knots beneath her palm, hard as oak. He flinched, but didn't pull away. He let out a sharp breath through his teeth, a hiss of sound. His eyes were closed now, his face a mask of stoic endurance. With her other hand, she took the heated knife and pressed the point against the wood splinter. She had to be quick. She leveraged the blade, and with a sickening tug, the splinter came free. A strangled cry was torn from his throat. His entire body arched in a spasm of agony, and his hand finally flew from his own knife, not to attack her, but to grip his thigh, his knuckles white. Alina dropped her knife with a clatter and immediately pressed a clean strip of linen torn from her only spare petticoat against the wound to stanch the fresh flow of blood. He lay panting, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill he must be feeling. His eyes opened again, but the sharp, defensive fire in them was banked, replaced by a raw, pain-filled vulnerability. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt he wasn't seeing a white woman, an enemy, but simply the person who had both caused and relieved his agony. The storm outside seemed to redouble its fury. As if enraged by the quiet act of mercy within the cabin, rain hammered against the roof, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Inside, the world had shrunk to the space around the fire, a small island of warmth and flickering light. Here, there were no soldiers, no judgmental townfolk, only two people clinging to life. Alina worked methodically, her fear receding as the practical needs of the moment took over. She cleaned the wound as best she could with boiled water and more strips of her petticoat. She found a small tin of pine tar salve she used for cuts and burns and applied it gently. He watched her hands as she worked, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw how they trembled slightly, yet how sure their movements were. She had to get the rest of his wet clothes off. His buckskin leggings were soaked and caked with mud. The task was more awkward and intimate than removing his shirt. She untied the leather cord at his waist, her face burning, acutely aware of the blanket that was her only covering. She tried to be efficient, impersonal. Keeping her eyes fixed on her task, she pulled the heavy, wet leather down his legs, revealing more old scars and the lean, powerful build of a man who lived his life on the move. She worked a blanket under him, then covered him with another, tucking it in around his shoulders. The fever was still raging. He began to shiver, his teeth chattering in a violent rhythm that shook his whole frame. She refilled a cup with water from the bucket, now thankfully inside, and held it to his lips. He drank greedily at first, then pushed it away weakly. He muttered something in his own language, the words rough and guttural, completely incomprehensible to her. She settled back on her heels, the immediate work done. The fire cast long, dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel both larger and more confining. Now that the adrenaline had faded, she was aware again of her own state. She was cold, exposed, and trembling from more than just the chill. She retrieved her discarded chemise. It was still damp, but it was better than nothing. She quickly pulled the simple garment over her head, feeling a small measure of security return as the thin cotton covered her. She sat on the single wooden chair, hugging her knees to her chest, and watched him, in sleep, or the fever-induced stupor he had fallen into. His face lost some of its harshness. The lines of pain around his mouth and eyes softened. He could have been her age, or a few years older. He was just a man who had been hunted, shot, and left to die by her people. The thought settled in her stomach like a cold stone. What had he done? Had he raided a settlement, stolen horses, or had he simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? His only crime, the color of his skin. She had no way of knowing. And what did it matter now? He was here, in her home, his life tenuously in her hands. She remembered Jedediah Croft's face, twisted with false piety, as he told the town elders how she had tempted him. She remembered the women who had once been her friends turning their backs on her at the general store, their whispers like the rustle of snakes in dry grass. They had all decided what she was without knowing her heart. They had wrapped her in the blanket of their prejudice, and it had nearly suffocated her. Looking at the Navajo warrior, she saw a reflection of her own plight. He was wrapped in a blanket of prejudice, too woven from a century of fear, hatred, and misunderstanding. By saving him, by bringing him inside, she had stepped out of her world and into his. She had crossed a line, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that there was no going back. The storm outside was a physical thing. It would eventually pass. But the storm of what she had done, of harboring a fugitive Navajo, was a storm that would follow her for the rest of her days. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The man, Yiska, stirred in his sleep, his hand twitching. Alina watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. The flickering light from the hearth was a fragile truce, a warm, breathing thing in the heart of the cold darkness. It was the beginning of something, though she couldn't say what. It was a shared breath in the belly of the beast, a flicker of trust born from desperation, and for now, in the howling wilderness of the New Mexico territory, it was enough. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind's tormented howl softened to a whisper, and the relentless drumming of rain on the sod roof slowed to a gentle patter before ceasing altogether. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the cabin's single small window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The world outside was washed clean, reborn, inside. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and fever. Alina had not slept. She'd spent the night dozing in her chair, waking with a start at every groan or shiver from the man on her floor. She'd kept the fire fed and repeatedly bathed his brow with a cool, damp cloth. Sometime before sunrise, the violent shivers had stopped, and the searing heat of his skin had begun to recede. His fever had broken. When he woke, it was with a quiet stillness. His eyes, no longer clouded by delirium, were clear and sharp. He watched her for a long moment as she ladled rabbit broth from a pot over the fire into a bowl. She felt his gaze on her, steady and assessing. There was no menace in it now, only a deep, weary caution. She approached him slowly, holding out the bowl. "Broth," she said, the word sounding loud in the quiet room. "It is not much, but it is warm." He pushed himself up on one elbow, his movements stiff with pain. He accepted the bowl, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a strange jolt through her. He drank the broth slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When he was finished, he handed the empty bowl back, a silent transaction. A truce. "Alina," she said, touching her own chest. She repeated it. "Alina Carter." He watched her lips form the sounds. After a moment, a low, gravelly voice answered. "Rusty from disuse, Yiska." He touched his own chest. Yiska. A name. He was no longer just a Navajo, a stranger. He was Yiska. The simple exchange felt monumental, a bridge built of two words across a chasm of silence and suspicion. But the peace of the moment was fleeting. A sudden desperate urgency flashed in Yiska's eyes. He set the bowl aside and struggled to sit up fully, ignoring the agony that the movement clearly caused him. He began to speak in his own tongue, the words flowing in an urgent, pleading stream she could not understand. He gestured wildly toward the door, then mimicked the motion of the flowing creek, of the storm. He looked around the small cabin as if searching for something, his desperation growing with every passing second. "I don't understand," Alina said, holding up her hands. "You must rest. Your leg." He ignored her, his breathing growing ragged. He was looking for something he had lost, something vital. Pushing aside the blankets, he tried to stand. His injured leg gave way instantly, and he cried out, catching himself before he collapsed completely. Alina rushed to his side. "Stop, you will kill yourself!" He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He stared into her eyes, his own filled with a raw anguish that transcended language. He pointed again toward the creek, then cupped his hands together, rocking them gently. A universal gesture. A baby. Alina's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. She had seen nothing. But the look on his face was one of pure terror. A father's terror. She had to go. She had to look. "Stay," she commanded, pressing him gently back down. "I will go." She pulled on her boots and ran from the cabin, her heart pounding with a new kind of dread. The air was cool and clean, the ground a soft, muddy tapestry of washed-out earth. She followed the path of dragged mud she had made the day before, her eyes scanning the creek bank, now littered with debris from the flash flood. She saw nothing but rocks and broken branches. Her hope began to fail. Perhaps he had been delirious after all, but his desperation had felt too real. She pushed deeper into the cluster of salt cedars where she had first found him, her dress catching on the thorny branches. And then she saw it. Tucked into a small hollow at the base of a large rock, partially shielded from the worst of the storm, was a Navajo cradleboard. It was beautifully made of carved wood and leather, but it was soaked through. Fearfully, she knelt and peered inside. Bundled in layers of rabbit fur lay the stillest, smallest baby she had ever seen. A boy. His skin was a pale, dusky color, his lips tinged with blue. For a terrible second, she thought he was dead. Then she saw a faint, fluttery movement beneath his ribs. A breath. Clutching the cradleboard to her chest, she ran back, scrambling and sliding in the mud. She burst into the cabin, breathless. "I have him. He's alive." Yiska let out a sound that was half sob, half prayer of relief. He reached out with trembling hands, and she placed the cradleboard before him. He unwrapped the furs with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his warrior's frame, revealing the tiny, fragile infant. The baby was cold to the touch, his body limp. A weak, mewling cry, thin as a thread, escaped his lips. It was the sound that broke Alina. That tiny, hopeless cry pierced through her own carefully constructed walls of grief and denial. It took her back a year, to a dark, cold night in a woodshed behind Jedediah Croft's sprawling ranch house. It brought back the memory of a secret born of her shame, a tiny life that had flickered and died before it had ever truly begun. She had held her own lost child, just for a moment, before it was taken away, another part of the scandal to be buried and forgotten. The loss had hollowed her out, leaving an ache that never truly went away. Her body, in its cruel wisdom, had prepared for a child that never came. The baby in the cradleboard began to cry again, a desperate, hungry sound. Yiska tried to give him a fingertip dipped in water, but the infant was too weak to suck. Turning his head away with a feeble protest, he was starving, fading before their eyes. And then something happened inside Alina. A deep, primal instinct surged through her, an undeniable biological command. She felt a familiar, aching fullness in her breasts, a sensation she had tried for months to ignore. Her body remembered. "He needs milk," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yiska looked at her, his face a mask of despair. He understood. There was no goat, no cow. They were isolated, miles from any help. The child was going to die. Alina looked at the dying infant. then at the man whose hope was dying with him. In that moment, all the rules of the world of white and Navajo, of propriety and shame, melted away in the heat of her reawakened grief and a fierce, sudden instinct to protect. This was a life. It would not be lost. Not this one. Not again. With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned the front of her chemise. She lifted the baby from his cradleboard, his small, cold body a feather-light weight in her arms. She held him to her breast. He was weak, but the instinct was there. After a moment of fumbling, he latched on, his tiny mouth pulling desperately. Alina gasped, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked the breath from her lungs. It was a feeling of profound relief mixed with the sharpest agony of her own loss. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She was not just feeding a stranger's child, she was nourishing a part of her own soul that she thought had died forever. Yiska watched, utterly silent. He sat like a man carved from stone, his face unreadable. But as he looked at the white woman crying silently as she gave his sister's son the gift of life from her own body, he saw something that transcended race and conflict. He saw Shima, mother. The woman who had been his potential enemy was now the only hope for his bloodline. She was no longer just a rescuer. She was sacred. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Miles away, in the dusty, sun-baked settlement of Redemption, a trapper named Silas Blackwood slapped a wet bundle of beaver pelts on the bar of the saloon. He'd been checking his lines up north when the storm had hit, forcing him to take shelter in a rock outcropping. From his vantage point, he'd seen something strange, the Carter girl, the one who'd been run out of Texas, dragging what looked like a dead Indian toward her sadi. "Saw the strangest thing," he announced to the bartender, his voice loud enough for the half-dozen listless patrons to hear. "That disgraced girl living out on the flatlands. Holed up with a Navajo buck. Dragged him right into her house yesterday, in the middle of the storm." He took a long drink of the whiskey the bartender poured him. Seemed to me he was more dead than alive, but you never know with them, or with a woman like her. A murmur went through the room. The men exchanged looks, a mixture of contempt and morbid curiosity. The name Carter was already synonymous with scandal. Now, this new story added a darker, more dangerous layer. A white woman and an Indian. It was unnatural, treasonous. The whispers Alina had fled had caught up to her, and this time, they carried the weight of more than just social ruin. This time, they carried the threat of violence, unaware, as she held the sleeping infant to her chest. Alina had just saved one life, only to place her own, and Yiska's, in the gravest of danger. For 3 days, a fragile peace settled within the sod cabin. The world was reduced to the rhythm of survival, a quiet domesticity that felt both profound and precarious. The baby, who Yiska had named Nijoni in a soft murmur, a word he taught Alina meant beautiful, grew stronger with each passing day. His cries became less feeble, his small body less chilled, his dark eyes beginning to focus on Alina's face as she held him. A silent routine formed between them. Alina would nurse the child, her heart a confusing mix of remembered sorrow and present tenderness. Yiska, his leg propped up and tightly bandaged, would watch them, his expression unreadable but his gaze steady. He spent hours carving a piece of cottonwood root with his knife, the shavings falling onto the dirt floor. Slowly, the shape of a small, graceful horse emerged, a toy for the boy. They communicated in a broken language of gestures and single words. Yiska would point at the fire and say, "Ko." Alina would repeat it, then point and say, "Fire." He learned her words for water, meat, and sleep. She learned his for sky, earth, and danger. On the 4th day, the outside world intruded. A figure on horseback appeared on the horizon, a dark speck growing steadily larger against the vast blue sky. Alina saw him first from the doorway. He wasn't a soldier. His slouching posture and the pack mule trailing behind him suggested a prospector or a trapper. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She quickly stepped back inside, her heart hammering. "Someone is coming," she whispered. Though Yiska had already seen, he was instantly alert, the quiet convalescent replaced by the wary warrior. He pulled himself into the darkest corner of the cabin, out of sight from the window, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The rider stopped a short distance from the cabin, hailing it with a loud, "Hello, the house!" Alina took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. The man was grizzled and lean, his eyes squinting from a lifetime of staring into the sun. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tipping a sweat-stained hat. "Name's Phineas Cole, just passing through. Wondered if you might spare a bit of water for a thirsty man." "Of course," Alina said, her voice tighter than she wanted. She gestured to the water barrel. As he dismounted and drank from the dipper, his eyes roved over her small homestead. They were sharp, missing nothing. "Live out here all alone, do you?" he asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I do," she lied. His gaze flickered to the ground near the door, where 2 sets of tracks were still visible in the drying mud, her smaller boot prints and the distinct impression of a man's moccasins. His eyes then caught the faint wisp of smoke from the chimney. A fire for one person on a warm day seemed excessive. "Brave woman," he said, his tone holding a new note of speculation. "Lots of trouble out this way. Army patrols are thick as flies. They're hunting that Navajo bunch that got into a skirmish up by the Cimarron. Killed a trooper. They say." Alina felt the blood drain from her face. "I see. I keep to myself." Phineas Cole gave a slow nod, his gaze lingering on the cabin door for a second too long. "Well, much obliged for the water." He swung back onto his horse. "You take care now, ma'am. A lone woman is a tempting target for all sorts of predators." He gave her a final, knowing look before nudging his horse into a walk, heading east, toward redemption. The moment he was gone, Alina stumbled back inside, her legs shaking. Yiska was already moving, the pretense of healing forgotten. Pain etched lines on his face as he pushed himself to his feet, using the wall for support. "Soldiers," he said, the English word clear and harsh. He pointed in the direction the prospector had gone. "He will talk." The dam of their fragile peace broke. A terrible urgency filled the small room. Using the dirt floor as his canvas, Yiska began to tell his story. He drew stick figures, several wearing the flat-brimmed hats of the cavalry, others with the long hair of his own people. He drew a crosshatch of lines between them, a fight. He pointed to one of the Navajo figures, then drew a smaller figure beside her, a baby. He looked at Najoni, sleeping peacefully on the pallet, and touched his own chest. His sister. He then drew one of the soldier figures falling and pointed at himself, shaking his head violently. He hadn't done it. He drew an arrow flying from a different direction, from the chaos. He had been part of a small band, traveling to a sacred site. They had been ambushed. In the bloody confusion, his sister was killed, a soldier fell, and the rest scattered or were cut down. He had been wounded, but he had grabbed his nephew and fled, running until he collapsed by the creek. Alina understood with chilling clarity. The prospector, Cole, would ride into redemption and trade his story for a bottle of whiskey. A woman living with an Indian. The story would find its way to the nearest army post. The soldiers hunting the murderer of their comrade would have their target. They would ride here, to her cabin. They would not listen to the truth from a savage or the fallen woman who harbored him. They would see only what they expected to see: guilt, and they would deliver their brutal, summary justice. Her sadi, the shelter she had built with her own hands, her refuge from the world's judgment, had become a cage. Staying was a death sentence. "We have to leave," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "Tonight." Yiska nodded, his jaw set. There was no other choice. They left as the moon rose, a silver sickle in a black sky. The departure was swift and silent. Alina packed what she could into a canvas sack, the last of her flour and salted beef, a tin of matches, and the precious pine tar salve. She took the heavy wool blanket from her pallet and filled her water skin. The last thing she took was her father's old Springfield rifle that leaned in a corner, along with a pouch of ammunition. It was heavy and unwieldy, but it was the only protection she had ever known. Yiska, limping badly, had fashioned a crude crutch from a sturdy branch. He strapped Najoni's cradleboard to his own back, the sleeping child bundled securely against the steady rhythm of his father's heart. Before they left, he placed the small, carved wooden horse in the baby's blankets. Alina took one last look at the dark interior of the cabin. It was more than a home. It was the place she had been broken and the place she had begun to heal. It had been a tomb of loneliness and a womb of unlikely connection. She pulled the heavy door shut, leaving that part of her life behind forever. They moved west, away from the dawn, melting into the vast, shadow-drenched landscape. The prairie grass whispered around them, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The journey was a brutal education. The endless rolling plains that looked so peaceful from her doorway were, in reality, a treacherous expanse. The days were a furnace, the sun beating down with a physical weight. The nights were a sudden, shivering cold that seeped into their bones. Their survival became a partnership forged in desperation. Yiska, even injured, was a part of this land. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the subtle language of the terrain. He taught Alina to walk on the balls of her feet to leave less of a track. He showed her how to find a seep of water at the base of a rock outcropping that looked utterly dry. He taught her to build a Dakota fire pit, a small hole in the ground that hid the flames and channeled the smoke, making them all but invisible. He pointed out the broad leaves of the yucca plant, showing her how to harvest the edible root, and warned her away from the deceptively bright berries of the nightshade. In return, Alina's strengths became their anchor. Every evening, she would clean and redress his wound, her touch gentle but firm, keeping the ever-present threat of infection at bay. She was the keeper of their dwindling supplies, rationing the food with a discipline born of her own solitary hardship. And she was Najoni's life source. Several times a day, they would stop in a sheltered ravine or the shadow of a mesa. Yiska would stand guard, his back to them, while Alina nursed the baby. In these quiet moments, the world fell away, and there was only the fierce, protective love she felt for the child and the silent, watchful presence of the man who entrusted him to her. He was learning to depend on her, to trust her, and in his quiet deference, she felt a measure of respect she had never known from any man. A week into their flight, they came to a river, wider and faster than any creek, its brown water churning with the runoff from the distant mountains. It was a barrier, a physical representation of the line they were trying to cross. There was no bridge, no shallow ford. "We must cross," Yiska said, his gaze fixed on the far bank. "Their tracks will be lost in the water." The crossing was a terrifying ordeal. Yiska went first, testing the current, his crutch useless in the sucking mud. The water surged to his waist, pulling at his injured leg. He gritted his teeth, his face a mask of pain. He came back for her. "The child," he said, pointing to the cradleboard on his back. "Hold him high." Alina took the rifle, holding it above her head with one hand. With the other, she gripped Yiska's arm. They stepped into the shockingly cold water together. The current was a living thing, a powerful beast that tried to rip their feet from under them. Yiska leaned into it, a solid, immovable anchor. Alina felt her feet slipping on the slick rocks, but his grip held her fast. The water rose to her chest, cold and terrifying. She held Najoni's cradleboard as high as she could, praying the child would stay dry. They fought for every foot, a desperate, stumbling battle against the river's strength. Finally, their feet found purchase on the muddy bank of the other side. They collapsed onto the ground, soaked, shivering, and utterly exhausted. As the sun began to set, they found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the rock face. Alina built a small, smokeless fire while Yiska checked on Najoni, who had miraculously slept through the entire ordeal. Alina looked back across the river, now a dark, churning ribbon in the twilight. Her cabin, her past, Phineas Cole. The soldiers, they were all on the other side. They had crossed over. It felt like a baptism, a violent washing away of who they had been. The physical storm was long gone, but now, huddled together in a cave in the vast wilderness, a new storm was gathering within them, one of shared survival, unspoken trust, and a future as wild and uncertain as the land itself. The land had changed. The flat, endless prairie had given way to a broken country of soaring mesas and deep, shadowed canyons. Their journey had become a grueling climb, a constant battle against sharp rock and steep inclines. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a merciless sun. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by a storm. They were a single, synchronized entity. A small family moving with a shared purpose through a world that wanted them erased. Their communication had evolved beyond single words into a language of its own, woven from gestures, glances, and a profound, intuitive understanding of each other's needs. Alina knew from the set of Yiska's shoulders if he sensed danger. He knew from the slight tremor in her hands when her strength was failing. They moved as one, slept in shifts, and shared the last of their food without a word. Alina was no longer the frightened girl from the Sadi. She was a creature of the wilderness, her skin browned by the sun, her body lean and tough, her eyes holding the steady, watchful calm of a survivor. Yiska was no longer just a hunted warrior. He was a guardian. Every step he took, every decision he made, was measured against the safety of the woman and child who had become his compass, his true north. The cold rain began in the late afternoon, a sudden shift from the oppressive heat. It wasn't the violent fury of the prairie storm, but a chilling, persistent downpour that soaked them in minutes and turned the rocky ground into a treacherous slick. The wind that swept through the canyons had teeth, biting through their thin clothes and sapping the warmth from their bodies. Yiska, spotting a deep fissure in a sandstone cliff face, led them to a cave, its entrance partially obscured by a curtain of ancient, gnarled juniper. The shelter was a blessing, a deep, dry hollow that protected them from the wind and rain. But as the evening wore on, a new and more terrifying storm gathered within their small sanctuary. It started with a whimper. Najoni, who had been an exemplar of quiet resilience, began to fuss. When Alina tried to nurse him, he turned his head away, his small body rigid. His cry was no longer the healthy cry of hunger, but a thin, pained wail that tore at her heart. She laid a hand on his forehead, and a wave of ice-cold dread washed over her. He was burning with fever. The hours that followed were a descent into a waking nightmare for Alina. The small, rational part of her mind knew the cause, the constant exposure. The river crossing. The hardship of the trail had finally breached the baby's fragile defenses. But the mother in her, the woman haunted by the ghost of a lost child, felt only a raw, unreasoning terror. She worked frantically, her movements fueled by a desperate energy. She used their cleanest rags, dipped in the precious water from their skin, to bathe his tiny, hot body. The water would cool on his skin and seemed to steam in the chilly cave air. He shivered and cried, a sound of pure misery. Yiska kept the fire small but hot, providing the only warmth in their damp, cold world. He stood at the mouth of the cave, a silent, unmoving silhouette against the dreary, weeping landscape. His warrior's skills were useless here. He could fight soldiers, hunt game, and read the land like a book, but he could not fight the fire raging inside his sister's son. Helpless, he turned his fear into vigilance. He stood guard, his eyes scanning the rain-swept wilderness, his ears tuned to any sound that was not the wind or the rain. He was a stone wall between his family and the rest of the world, protecting the heart-wrenching drama unfolding behind him. He watched her. He saw the way she held Najoni. Her body curved into a protective shell around him. He saw the tears she didn't know she was crying stream down her face as she murmured soft, nonsensical words of comfort to the child. He heard her pray in her own language, her voice a raw, pleading whisper to a God he did not know. In that moment, she was the fiercest warrior he had ever seen, armed not with a rifle or a knife, but with a love so powerful it seemed to be the only thing keeping the child's fragile life tethered to the world. The night was endless. Alina drifted in a state of exhausted delirium, her entire being focused on the small, struggling life in her arms. She lost all sense of time, of the cold, of her own shivering body. There was only the baby, the heat of his skin, and the desperate rhythm of her own heart beating out a prayer, please, please, not this one. 2. Just before the first hint of dawn, when the darkness is at its deepest and coldest, she felt it, a change. The violent, feverish heat of Najoni's body seemed to lessen. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. His rigid limbs relaxed, and his pained cries softened into a series of quiet, exhausted breaths. He stirred against her, his small mouth blindly seeking her breast. The fever had broken. Relief so profound it was painful washed through Alina. It was a physical wave that left her limbs feeling like water, her head light. She began to tremble uncontrollably, the cold she had ignored for hours seizing her body in its grip. Yiska saw it, too. He had been watching, waiting, and he recognized the subtle shift from crisis to calm. He left his post at the entrance and moved into the deeper warmth of the cave. The firelight cast his shadow long and protective on the stone wall. He looked at Alina, huddled on the ground, her thin chemise damp from her efforts, her face pale and etched with exhaustion in the flickering light. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. He acted without hesitation. He took the thickest, warmest of their coverings, a cured buffalo hide he had carried with him, a precious remnant of his old life, and knelt before her. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, then at the damp cloth clinging to her shoulders. His meaning was clear. The wet chemise was stealing her body heat, endangering her now that the adrenaline had fled. There was no room for shame or modesty in this world they inhabited. There was only life and death, warmth and cold. With a weary, trusting nod, Alina allowed him to help her. His fingers were surprisingly gentle as he untied the ribbon at her neck and helped her draw the damp garment from her shoulders, never letting the buffalo hide fall away. He immediately wrapped the heavy, warm fur around her and the sleeping baby, tucking it securely, enclosing them both in a dark, safe cocoon. He remained kneeling before her, his face level with hers. The firelight softened the sharp angles of his features, warming the deep black of his eyes. He slowly raised a hand, not to her body, but to her face, with a reverence that made her breath catch. He gently brushed a damp strand of hair from her temple, his thumb stroking her skin for just a moment. Their eyes met, and in the profound silence of the cave, a lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. He saw not a disgraced white woman, but a miracle of strength and tenderness, the fierce heart of his world. She saw not a dangerous savage, but a man of deep feeling, a steadfast protector whose quiet presence was her only anchor. It was a gaze stripped bare of all prejudice, all fear, all pretense. It held gratitude, awe, and a shared vulnerability that was more intimate than any touch. He did not pull away. He shifted, moving to sit beside her on the cave floor, so close that their legs touched. He drew one edge of the great buffalo hide over his own shoulders, creating a shared tent of warmth. Then, he slid his arm around her, pulling her and the precious bundle of the sleeping child against his side. The embrace was not one of hungry passion, but of homecoming. It was solid, comforting, and absolute. Alina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and leaned her head against his shoulder. The hard muscle and bone felt like the safest place on earth. The storm outside had softened to a gentle drumming. Inside their cave, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and each other, a new weather system had formed. It was a love that had not been sought or declared, but had simply grown, green and tenacious like a flower in a rock crevice, nurtured by shared loss and the desperate, sacred act of survival. As the first gray light of dawn crept into the cave, illuminating a world washed clean and new, Alina finally closed her eyes. Shielded by the man beside her, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Yiska did not move. He kept his vigil, his arm holding his family, his gaze fixed on the entrance. He was no longer just a warrior on the run. He was a man watching over his entire world. The days that followed their ordeal in the cave were marked by a quiet, profound shift. The space between them, once filled with unspoken questions and cautious distance, now held a shared warmth, a tenderness as tangible as the heat from their nightly fire. They were no longer merely allies in survival, but partners in a life forged on the run. Yiska's hand would find hers to help her over a difficult patch of rock, and the touch would linger a moment longer than necessary. She would pass him a piece of cooked rabbit, and their eyes would meet over the flames in a look of deep, settled affection. Nijoni, secure on Yiska's back during the day and cradled in Alina's arms at night, was the living heart of their small, wandering world. They had descended from the high mesas into a valley carved by an ancient river, a swath of relative green that offered more game and cover. Yiska believed the ancestral lands of his people, a sanctuary the soldiers rarely dared to enter, lay only a few more days' journey to the north, for the first time in weeks. A fragile hope began to take root in Alina's heart. She allowed herself to imagine a future, a place where the running could stop. It was this hope that made the sudden intrusion of violence so jarring. They had made camp in a small aspen grove near a clear, fast-running stream. The afternoon sun, filtered through the trembling yellow leaves, dappled the ground in shifting patterns of light. Alina was humming a half-forgotten lullaby to Nijoni, while Yiska was carefully sharpening his knife on a whetstone. It was a scene of almost impossible peace, and then it shattered. Yiska went still first, his head snapping up, his nostrils flaring slightly, like a deer catching a scent on the wind. He had heard something or felt it, a discordant note in the valley's symphony. "Get the child," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. Before Alina could react, they emerged from the trees. There were 3 of them. They were not soldiers in clean blue uniforms. They were hard men with cruel, avaricious eyes, their clothes a patchwork of worn leather and filthy canvas. They carried pistols at their hips and rifles cradled in their arms with a casual familiarity. These were the wolves of the frontier, the men who hunted other men for money. The leader, a big man with a tangle of a red beard and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, gave them a yellow-toothed smile. "Well, look what we have here, Rourke. Ain't this a pretty sight?" he said to one of his companions. Just like that fella in Redemption said, a white squaw and her buck. Alina scrambled to her feet, clutching Nijoni to her chest. The baby, sensing her fear, began to cry. Yiska rose slowly, placing himself between her and the men. He didn't reach for his knife, knowing it would be a suicidal move. He stood with his hands slightly away from his sides, his body a shield. "The price on a Navajo scalp from the Cimarron fight is $200. The leader, Rourke, continued, his voice conversational, yet laced with venom. He took a step forward, his eyes sweeping over Alina with a contemptuous leer. "But a pretty little thing like you might be worth more if we bring you back to civilization, clean you up a bit, remind you of your place." "Leave her out of this," Yiska said, his English clipped and guttural. "This is my fight." Rourke laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your fight, boy. Your fight was over the moment you were born. We're just here to collect." He gestured with his rifle. "Now, you'll drop that knife belt, nice and slow. And the girl will hand over the little half-breed. We got no use for that." The world narrowed for Alina. The casual cruelty of the man's words, the way he dismissed Najoni's life as worthless, ignited a cold, hard rage in her belly that burned away every last vestige of fear. This was the voice of the world that had cast her out. The voice of Jedediah Croft. The voice of the town gossips, the voice of a brutal, self-righteous society that judged and destroyed what it did not understand. One of Rourke's men, a lanky youth with nervous eyes, grew impatient. He raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at Yiska's chest. "Let's just shoot him. Rourke, be quicker." "Hold on. Now," Rourke said, though he made no move to stop him. "Don't want to damage the goods." Yiska's body tensed. He knew he couldn't dodge the bullet, not with his bad leg. He could only stand his ground, his eyes locked on the bounty hunter, a final, defiant act of a warrior. In that frozen moment, as the young man's finger tightened on the trigger, Alina moved. Her father's Springfield rifle was leaning against the pack where she had set it down. In 3 swift steps, she seized it. The heavy, oiled wood felt familiar in her hands. She was not a warrior. She had only ever used this rifle to hunt rabbits and scare off coyotes. But as she raised the butt to her shoulder and sighted down the long barrel, her hands were perfectly steady. Everything went silent, as if the world was holding its breath. The bounty hunters, who had dismissed her as a mere prize, a squaw, stared in disbelief. They saw a woman transformed. Her face, framed by strands of hair whipped loose by the valley wind, was a mask of cold, lethal fury. She did not aim for the man. She aimed at the ground just in front of his boots. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the rifle was a deafening crack that echoed off the valley walls. A plume of dirt and rock fragments erupted at the bounty hunter's feet, causing him to cry out and stumble backward, his own shot going wild into the sky. The image was seared into the moment, the flash of orange flame from the muzzle reflected in her wide, determined eyes, the acrid smell of gunpowder cutting through the clean mountain air, the sheer, shocking force of her defiance. She had broken every rule. A woman, a white woman, had raised a weapon to defend a Navajo against her own kind. She had declared her allegiance, not with words, but with fire. The bounty hunters were stunned into a half-second of inaction. It was all the time Yiska needed. "Asterisk! Now asterisk!" he roared. He shoved Alina and Najoni toward the thick cover of the forest behind them, then spun, his knife finally appearing in his hand as if by magic. He threw it, not at a man, but at the rope holding Rourke's pack mule. The animal, startled by the gunshot and the whizzing blade, screamed and bolted, scattering supplies and creating another moment of chaos. Rourke and his men recovered, firing their rifles wildly into the trees where Alina and Yiska had disappeared. "Get them!" Rourke bellowed, his face purple with rage. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces. Yiska, ignoring the fire in his leg, half carried, half dragged Alina, who held Najoni tight. The baby's frightened cries muffled against her shoulder. A bullet whizzed past Alina's head, so close she heard it hiss. Another struck a tree beside her, sending a shower of bark into her face. As they scrambled over a fallen log, a searing, white-hot pain shot through her left arm. She cried out, stumbling, but Yiska's grip held her up, pulling her onward. They didn't stop running until the sounds of pursuit faded and the forest grew deep and silent around them. They found refuge in a narrow crevice between 2 massive boulders, a space barely big enough for the 3 of them. Only then did the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a shaking exhaustion. Alina slumped against the cold rock, gasping for breath. She looked down and saw the dark stain spreading across the sleeve of her dress. The pain, which had been a distant shock, now returned as a sharp, throbbing burn. A bullet had grazed her bicep, tearing a bloody furrow through the flesh. After ensuring Nijoni was unharmed and calming him with a soft murmur, Yiska turned to her. His face was grim, but his eyes held a look of fierce, protective tenderness. He gently took her arm, his hands exploring the wound. The roles were now utterly reversed. In the sati, she had been the healer, and he the wounded warrior. Now, in this dark crevice, he was the caregiver. He used his knife to carefully slit her sleeve, exposing the injury. He clicked his tongue at the sight, but said nothing. He took out a small leather pouch from his belt, the one where he kept his medicines. He created a poultice from a pinch of dried herbs and some moss, mixing it with a little water. His touch was incredibly gentle as he cleaned the wound and applied the soothing balm before binding it tightly with a clean strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. He worked in silence, his complete focus on her. When he was finished, he did not move away. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw everything: his gratitude for her courage, his anger at her injury, and a love so profound it needed no words. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of absolute unity. The world had thrown its worst at them: its prejudice, its greed, its violence. It had wounded her, but as she sat there, safe in the circle of his care, Alina knew that it had failed. The attack had not broken them. It had only burned away any lingering doubts, forging their three separate lives into a single, defiant soul, stronger and more resilient than steel. The arm Yiska had wrapped around her was a constant, solid presence, a silent promise in the darkness. The graze on her own arm was a throbbing, physical reminder of the world they were fleeing, a brand of her final, irrevocable break with the society that had birthed her. They traveled for 5 more days, moving through a landscape that grew increasingly sacred and severe. The canyons narrowed, their walls rising like titanic, red rock cathedrals, carved by wind and water into shapes that were both beautiful and intimidating. Yiska's limp had eased, his body healing with the clean air and his own resilient strength. But as they drew closer to his home, a new tension settled in his shoulders. He was no longer just a protector guiding them through a hostile wilderness. He was a son of his people, bringing home a living, breathing complication. He was bringing a white woman. Their destination was not a village of teepees or lodges visible on an open plain. It was a secret, a place woven into the very fabric of the canyonlands. Yiska led them along a barely perceptible trail that hugged a sheer cliff face, then down a steep, treacherous path of switchbacks into a canyon deeper and wider than any they had yet seen. And at the bottom, hidden from the world by the labyrinthine rock walls, was his home. It was called Tse Daishaj, the Split Rock Place, a small, clear river, the lifeblood of the community. Snaked through the canyon floor, corn, squash, and beans grew in terraced fields that climbed the lower slopes. Scattered among groves of cottonwood trees were dozens of hogans, the traditional 8-sided dwellings of the Dina, their packed earth walls blending almost perfectly with the landscape. Smoke curled lazily from their smoke holes, and the sounds of children laughing and the rhythmic chop of an axe echoed softly in the enclosed space. It was a place of profound peace, a sanctuary that felt 1,000 miles and 1,000 years away from the brutal, grasping world of the bounty hunters. But for Alina, the peace was a wall she could not penetrate. Their arrival caused an immediate, silent ripple through the community. Work stopped. Laughter died. Faces turned toward them, and 100 pairs of dark, unreadable eyes fixed on her. They saw Yiska, their warrior, returned from the dead. They saw Nijoni, the son of his lost sister, alive and healthy, and they saw her, the Bilagana, the white woman. Her skin, even sun-browned and travel-stained, was a stark, alien beacon in this place of earthy reds and browns. Her dress, though tattered, was a foreign garment. Her eyes were the wrong color. The welcome for Yiska was heartfelt. An older woman with a face like a beautiful, wrinkled map rushed forward, tears streaming down her cheeks, and embraced him, murmuring his name, his mother. Others gathered, touching his arm, their relief palpable. But their warmth did not extend to Alina. They looked past her, through her, their expressions a mixture of suspicion, resentment, and cold, hard curiosity. The whispers started immediately. Soft hisses in a language she did not understand, but their meaning was universal. Asterisk, who is she? Why is she here? Asterisk. Yiska spoke to his mother and an older, dignified man with streaks of silver in his long black hair, the community's headman. Or Nat Anai, named Hashke. His voice was low and steady as he explained, gesturing toward Alina, toward Najoni, then back toward the direction from which they had come. Alina stood alone, holding the baby, feeling more exposed and judged than she had even in redemption. These were the people she had helped save. Yet, in their eyes, she was a threat, a potential spy, the harbinger of the very violence they had built this sanctuary to escape. No one spoke to her. After the initial explanation, Yiska's mother, a woman named Astza, led them to a small, empty hogan on the edge of the settlement. She laid out sheepskin pallets and gave them a bowl of stew and a basket of flat, warm bread. But her movements were stiff, her face a mask of polite, impenetrable reserve. The days that followed were the loneliest of Alina's life. Yiska was caught between two worlds, torn between his gratitude and love for her and the deep-seated traditions and fears of his people. He was often called away to speak with Hashke and the other elders, recounting his ordeal, sharing what he knew of the soldiers' movements. During those times, Alina was utterly isolated. She was not a guest. She was a problem to be solved. She was given work, the hard, monotonous labor of the women. In the mornings, she would join a group of them at the communal grinding stones, kneeling for hours, rubbing dried corn into meal against the rough asterisk medita asterisk. The work was backbreaking, rubbing blisters on her hands and making every muscle in her back and shoulders ache. The other women worked with an easy, practiced rhythm, their conversation flowing around Alina as if she were a rock in a stream. They did not speak to her. If she met their eyes, they would look away. She was proving her willingness to work, but she was not earning their trust. She was still an outsider, the Bilagana, the woman who fired the rifle, the woman who had nursed Najoni. These were just pieces of Yiska's story, a story they seemed unwilling to fully believe. She found her purpose, as she always had, in caring for others. There was an old man in a nearby hogan, his lungs filled with a dry, rasping cough that kept him awake at night. She began to visit him, bringing him hot broth and using the last of her pine tar salve to make a steam he could inhale, a remedy she had learned from her own grandmother. She would sit with him, changing the cool cloths on his forehead. He couldn't speak to her, but his rheumy old eyes would follow her with a dawning gratitude. She helped the women with their weaving, not by touching the sacred looms, but by gathering the plants used for dyes and washing the raw wool in the cold river until her arms were numb. She learned by watching, by mimicking. She learned the word for water, two, and for bread, asterisk ba, and she learned the name they had for her. Spoken in whispers, she was not meant to hear asterisk, the one who walks between worlds asterisk. Her greatest comfort was Najoni. With him, she was not an outsider. She was simply Amma, mother. He was beginning to smile, a gummy, heart-stopping grin that he reserved just for her. The women of the village saw it. They saw the way the child, their blood, tracked her with his eyes, the way he quieted in her arms as in no other. It was a truth they could not deny, a bond that defied their suspicion. And it began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, soften the edges of their hostility. The test came after 2 weeks. The nights were growing colder. and the community gathered for a ceremony, a blessing for a safe and bountiful winter. A massive bonfire was lit in the center of the settlement, its flames leaping high into the star-dusted sky, painting the canyon walls in flickering shades of orange and red. The entire village was there, their faces illuminated by the firelight. A drum began a slow, steady, hypnotic beat, like the heart of the earth itself. Alina sat on the edge of the circle with Yiska and Nijoni, feeling the familiar weight of being both present and absent. Then, the drumming stopped. In the sudden silence, the headman, Hashke, rose to his feet. He was a man of immense presence, his quiet authority felt by everyone. He did not look at his people. He looked directly at Alina. He spoke her name, Alina Carter. A collective breath was drawn. Yiska's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip tight and reassuring. Hashke beckoned her to come forward. Her legs felt like lead, but she stood, holding the sleeping Nijoni in her arms, and walked into the circle of firelight. She stood before the headman, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment of judgment. Hashke spoke to Yiska first, in the Dine language. Yiska answered, his voice strong and clear, recounting their story for all to hear. He spoke of the storm, the wound, the fever. He spoke of the bounty hunters and the rifle shot. Then, his voice softened. He spoke of the baby, cold and dying, and of the life she had given him from her own body. When he was finished, a deep silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Hashke turned his gaze back to Alina. He was old, but his eyes were as clear and sharp as a hawk's. He looked at her, then down at the sleeping child in her arms. He took a step forward, and then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand, weathered and strong, and placed it gently on her chest, directly over her heart. His touch was warm and firm. He kept it there for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, looking past the color of her skin, past the fear and the hardship, searching for the truth of her spirit. Then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, not in his own tongue, but in the broken English he had learned from traders, so that she and the world she came from would understand his meaning. You gave this child your milk, he said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. You gave him life. He pressed his hand a little firmer against her heart. This is the work of a mother's heart. A heart knows no color. It knows only life. He removed his hand and stepped back. A long, collective sigh seemed to pass through the crowd. The judgment was over. The wall of suspicion had crumbled. As Alina stood there, tears blurring the firelight, Yiska's mother, Adza, came to her side. The older woman's face, once a mask of stoicism, was now soft with emotion. She reached out and touched Nijoni's cheek, then looked at Alina, and for the first time, she smiled. She said a word, a single, beautiful word that Alina now understood. Shema, she said, mother. In the heart of a hidden canyon, surrounded by a people not her own, the girl who had been cast out had finally, truly, found her home. The passing of a season in Sé-Déchage was like a slow, sacred prayer. Winter draped the high canyon walls in shawls of snow, silencing the world under a blanket of pristine white. The people of the split rock drew inward, their lives centered around the warmth of their hogan fires. For Alina, it was a time of true belonging. She sat with the women, her fingers, once clumsy, now growing deft at spinning wool. She learned the rhythms of the Dine language, not just the words, but the stories and songs they carried. The hard lines of suspicion on the faces of the elders had softened into a gentle, familial affection. Her life with Yiska settled into a quiet rhythm of partnership. They were rarely more than a few feet apart, a single unit of purpose and affection. He taught her the constellations by their Navajo names, great heroes and animals sprawling across the impossibly black sky. She taught him to read a few words from a tattered primer she had carried, a relic of her old life. And between them, Najoni grew. He was a sturdy, laughing toddler now. His first steps taken on the packed earth of their hogan. His first words a mixture of two languages. One day, reaching for her as she entered the hogan, he called out a clear, perfect word that made her heart stop. Mother. It was a life she could never have dreamed of, a peace she had thought forever lost to her. But peace in this land was a fragile commodity. As the snows melted and the rivers swelled with the vigor of spring, the threat returned. It came in the form of a scout, a young man named Black Horse, who rode into the canyon on a lathered horse, his face grim. He had seen them from a high ridge, a long column of blue-coated soldiers, moving with a slow, methodical purpose. They were not a simple patrol. They were a survey party, accompanied by a full company of cavalry, mapping the territory, leaving no canyon unexplored. With them was a white man with a red beard who pointed and gestured, a man Black Horse had seen before in the town of Redemption, Rourke. The bounty hunter had brought the Outlaws army to their doorstep. The news fell like a stone in the heart of the community. A council was called, the elders gathering with Hashke in the center of the settlement. The options were grim. They could fight, but they would be hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. It would be a massacre. Or they could flee, abandoning their homes and their fields, undertaking a perilous journey deeper into the mountains with their children and their elderly. It would mean starvation for many and the loss of their ancestral home. Alina stood on the edge of the council circle, Najoni holding tight to her leg, and listened to the desperate, angry debate. Yiska stood with the warriors, his face a mask of cold fury, his hand resting on the knife at his hip. She saw the despair in the eyes of Astza, Yiska's mother, and the fear on the faces of the women she had come to call her sisters. And in that moment, she saw a third path, a narrow, terrifying path that only she could walk. She stepped forward into the circle. A hush fell over the council. It was not her place to speak, but the past months had granted her a status that transcended tradition. "Let me go to them," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the tense silence. Yiska turned to her, his eyes blazing. "No, Alina, you cannot. They will not see you as a negotiator. They will see a traitor, a captive. They will harm you. They will see a white woman," she countered, looking not at Yiska, but at the headman. "Hashke. They expect to find warriors. They will not expect to find me. It may confuse them. It may make them pause. A pause is all we need. A day. Maybe two. Enough time for the children and the elders to get a head start into the mountains if they must. I will not be a negotiator. I will be a diversion." "She is right," Hashke said, his old voice cutting through the arguments. "The wolf is often startled by the lamb that does not run." He looked at Alina, his gaze heavy. "This is a great risk. You are one of us now. We do not sacrifice our own." "You are not sacrificing me," Alina insisted. "I am choosing this. You have given me a home. You have given me a family. Let me do this to protect it." The farewell was the hardest thing she had ever done. Yiska held her, his arms wrapped around her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I should be the one," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "It is my duty to protect you." "You are," she whispered back, pulling away to look him in the eye. "Your duty is to Najoni. Protect our son. Get him to safety. That is all that matters." She kissed the sleeping toddler's head, entrusting him to Astza, and then turned away before her resolve could break. They gave her a steady mare and a strip of white cloth to carry. She rode out of the canyon alone, the morning sun at her back, retracing the path that had first brought her to salvation, a path she was now taking back into damnation. She found the soldiers in a wide basin 3 miles from the canyon's hidden entrance, the sight of them the precise blue lines, the glint of sun on rifle barrels. The confident authority of their presence was a physical shock. This was the world she had left, and it had come to reclaim its dominion. She raised the white cloth and rode slowly forward. A shout went up. Rifles were raised. A young lieutenant galloped out to meet her, his pistol drawn. He stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "What in God's name?" "I wish to speak with your commanding officer," Alina said, her voice hoarse but firm. She was escorted to the center of the column, where a man with captain's bars on his shoulders and a tired, professional face sat astride a fine bay horse. This was Captain Hayes. Beside him, looking triumphant, was the bounty hunter, Rourke. "Captain," Rourke sneered. "Told you she'd gone native. That's the one." Captain Hayes ignored him, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Alina. "Ma'am, my name is Captain Hayes. You are a long way from home. We have a report that you are being held against your will by the Navajo renegade, Yiska." "I am not being held by anyone, Captain," Alina said, meeting his gaze. "My name is Alina Carter, and I am here by choice. The man you call Yiska is not a renegade. He is my husband." A murmur went through the nearby soldiers. Hayes's expression hardened. "Your husband, ma'am. That man is wanted for the murder of a United States soldier." "No," Alina said, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "He is wanted for surviving an ambush where one of your soldiers was killed in the chaos. His sister, the mother of my child, was also killed that day, but there is no bounty for a dead Navajo woman. Is there?" She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "I am here to tell you that if you proceed into that canyon, you will not find a war party. You will find a village. You will find old men and women. You will find mothers and children. You will find my son. The people there have done nothing to you. They wish only to live in peace. Are your orders to hunt a murderer, Captain, or are they to make war on families?" Captain Hayes was silent, his gloved hands resting on his saddle horn. He was a man of duty, a man who followed orders. But Alina's words, her courage, and the undeniable truth in her eyes had struck a chord. He looked at Rourke's greedy, hateful face, then back at Alina's dignified defiance. He was caught between his orders and his conscience. "My orders are to locate the hostiles responsible for the death of Corporal Miller," he said finally, his voice stiff. "Your testimony is irregular. I cannot abandon my mission, but I will not proceed blindly." He turned to the young lieutenant. "You will take this woman's full statement. Send a rider to Fort Union with my report. We will make camp here and await confirmation and new orders." He had given her what she asked for: time. Alina's return to the canyon was met with a joyous, disbelieving celebration. When the people saw her silhouette appear on the high trail, a great cry went up. Yiska ran to meet her, lifting her from the horse and holding her as if he would never let her go. That evening, the great fire was lit once more. Hashke stood before his people and told them of Alina's courage. She walked out of our sanctuary to face the enemy, armed only with the truth. He declared, "She did not bring us war. She brought us a chance for peace. From this day forward, she will have a new name among us. We will call her *Yustso*, the White Dove." As the name was echoed by the crowd, Najoni, who had been clinging to Yiska's leg, toddled forward. He reached his small arms up to her. "Mother!" he cried, his voice clear as a bell. She swept him up, burying her face in his hair, her heart overflowing. Yiska came to stand beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back. He looked at her, his eyes full of a love that was as vast and deep as the canyon itself. "They call you Yustso," he said, his voice soft. "To the boy, you are mother." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "To me, you are not white. You are not Navajo. You are heart, my heart." As the sun dipped below the canyon rim, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange, purple, and gold, the three of them stood together, watching the last light of day fade. The threat had not vanished. It was merely delayed. Their future was as uncertain as the coming night, but they would face it together. A man who had found a family instead of revenge. A woman who had been remade in the crucible of the wilderness. A child who was the living bridge between their two worlds. A new family, born from a storm, now standing strong in the heart of the Wild West. Thank you for listening to this story. We're so grateful to have you as part of our audience. To help us connect, please leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. We love hearing your thoughts and sharing in this community. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a thumbs up. For extra support, please hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to us.